All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Procurement Under FEMA Awards. Thank you for spending time with us today. We're glad you're here. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted, and you can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you'd like to ask our presenter a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions may be addressed during the presentation. At the close of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief questionnaire. Your feedback is very valuable to us here at NASPO. Today's presentation is good for one contact hour. To get your certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. We're honored to have with us John Griego, Program Specialist and Contracting Officer, Representative with FEMA's Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, PDAT, where he manages the team's policy development portfolio and coordinates PDAT's suite of training development and delivery. Prior to joining FEMA, John worked as a U.S. Senate staffer in his hometown of Colorado Springs, focusing on military and veterans affairs. He is a graduate of the University of Denver Joseph Corbell School of International Studies with bachelor and master's degrees in public policy. John lives in Colorado and enjoys the state's many outdoor activities with his 4-year-old golden doodle. Before John begins his presentation, we have a quick poll for everyone so we can better understand who is in attendance today. Please take a second to answer this short poll, which will appear on your screen in just a moment. In addition to this poll, we would love to know what states are represented by our attendees and the agencies or organizations that are here today. If you'd like, you can enter this information in the chat now. All right, John, NASPO is excited to have you here with us, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, Kinsey, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're calling in from. As Kinsey had mentioned, right, my name is John Griego, and I am a program specialist with FEMA's Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, otherwise known as PDAT. And I believe, I hope that this is being shared. Okay. And I've been with the agency now for going on almost about coming up on 5 years. And as mentioned previously, I had worked as a U.S. Senate staffer in military and veterans affairs and kind of got involved with FEMA largely because my own community, hometown here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, was impacted by a wildfire back in 2012. And I can vividly remember emergency responders, first responders, and FEMA coming to aid my community. And so I really kind of planted a seed in my head a bit of why I wanted to get involved in this very important work. And so many of you I know who are working in the procurement space, welcome, and especially many thanks to you who are working in the emergency management space as well. So I do know that a couple of questions did come up on that poll. So if you don't mind just taking a quick second to answer those questions, as well as answer our icebreaker, what are your travel plans for this summer? Hopefully it is warm in your neck of the woods. Here in Colorado, we have a saying that, if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes. And it's quite true. I mean, this morning it was cold and rainy. It's now sunny, a bit, windy. We'll see if snow is in the forecast for our Memorial Day weekend. That's actually not uncommon out here in Colorado. So again, welcome everybody. It looks like a lot of great staycations or beach vacations, which is just fantastic. So welcome everybody. I am joined by my colleague, fellow program specialist with PDAT, Chris Simone, who will be monitoring the chat box. He will do his best to keep an eye on that because I believe that we have somewhere close to almost 1,000 folks on the chat box, or at least those who have registered. So if we don't get to your question right away, we will do our best to make sure that we follow up on these questions. And I will have Chris answer those in the chat box. And if I see something in the chat box that kind of, Oh, I see somebody living near the Royal Gorge. Hello, yes, hopefully probably right around in Canyon City or Fremont County. That's wonderful to see. That's cool. If I see something in the chat box, I'll make sure I pause and kind of take note, and it has wider applications to the general audience. I will make sure to make sure that I broadcast that right effectively. Okay. All right, guys. Let's go ahead and jump into the material. All right, guys, so a game plan for today's training. What we
Hey everyone, I'll just step in for a second. John just let me know that his team's crashed. But so I'll hand it back over, but just want to let you all know he's
He'll be back. We'll give him a minute. I'm so sorry. These things happen. He'll be all right. He'll be right back. There he is. You're muted right now.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully that wasn't too long. It's been, just for your awareness, Zoom has been dropping, but it kicks me back in. So I'm not sure what the bandwidth is. So I've closed out stuff on my end, so hopefully that helps. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and jump into today's material. Thankfully, that was at the beginning of this training. So what we hope that you will gain is a general understanding of these procurement under federal regulation requirements. This training is really designed both for the new procurement official as well as the seasoned procurement official, right? What we hope that you will gain is that ability to distinguish the difference between state and non-state entities and how to apply the applicable federal rules to each type of non-federal entity. You'll understand about key procurement requirements, such as full and open competition, learning about the 5 methods of procurement, as well as learning about there are 13 required contract provisions when procuring under a federal award. We'll learn about that, as well as a great resource a little bit later on. As well as introducing you to a number of different great PDAT tools and resources developed for your organizations. So let's go ahead. This is actually an interactive training, folks. So if you don't mind, just indulge me in a couple of warm-up questions. So for the first 48 hours after a disaster, all procurement requirements are waived. Is this a myth or is this truth? Okay, myth or truth? All procurement.
Hey John, yep. Just
yes.
FYI, I think you need to share the slides on
the
screen.
My God. Okay, that would help, wouldn't it? There it is. Sorry, team. Yes, the technology, but it looks like folks can at least hear me and see me, so that's a good thing. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Okay, yes, this is actually a myth busted. Yeah, so not all federal requirements or all procurement requirements are waived after 48 hours. There are some exceptions with regards to what we call emergency and exigent circumstances, which would allow your organizations to conduct what we call a non-competitive procurement or a sole source procurement. We'll learn a little bit more about that in our methods of procurement section. For our next question, you need prior approval from FEMA before sole sourcing during exigency and emergency circumstances. Myth or fact? What do we think? Go ahead and drop your questions into the chat box. like a pretty good mixture of fact and myth. This is actually another myth busted. You do not require FEMA's approval before conducting a sole source or a non-competitive procurement during emergency and exigent circumstances. What you will need to do is demonstrate or provide justification of why a non-competitive procurement is required, citing emergency and exigent circumstances. So that is a myth busted. All right, last one. Federal procurement requirements are stricter than state and local rules. What do we think there? Is that a fact or a myth? Fact or myth? All right, good mixture of questions. I love the depends. Yes, I'm sure we have some policy and legal folks on the call that, well, this might be depends upon the facts and circumstances of the procurement. So the answer to this one is another myth busted. Federal procurement requirements are usually not more restrictive than state and local requirements. What the federal procurement rules, what you'll learn about here momentarily, is that it provides that kind of structure or foundation for procurement under a federal award, right? Everything or stemming from state or local rules can be more restrictive. They just cannot be less restrictive than that federal foundation kind of thing. Yes, procurement team wants it depends shirts. I love that. That is a great suggestion. All right, guys, thanks so much for participating in that warm-up. Let's go ahead and jump into a little bit more about the background of these rules, okay? So procurement, as you can see here, is procurement non-compliance, rather, is quite costly. So that number that you see on your screen is the potentially ineligible contract costs due to non-compliance with the federal procurement rules. This comes from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Inspector General, which conducted audits from fiscal years 2012 through 2021. So this is really important for you all. While yes, your organizations, I would assume the majority of you represent state entity organizations. Not only would you be in the position of being a direct recipient of FEMA funds, but you also likely will serve as pass-through entities, okay? So these negative audits can often result in recommendations to FEMA by OIG in taking those funds back, right? Recoupment of funds is something that nobody here at FEMA likes to do, or denying it based upon cost reasonableness or that kind of thing. But specifically talking about the federal procurement under grant regulations, right? Here are the top 5 findings that we see that OIG has flagged for our consideration for noncompliance. Issues with general procurement standards. Maybe that might be the prolonged use of a time and materials contract beyond a period of which that it can be transitioned to maybe a firm fixed price contract or a cost reimbursement type contract. There's issues, of course. Number 2, for the longest time, had been number 1, is restricting full and open competition, which is a cornerstone of all federal procurements. We'll learn about the 7 areas that we see competition being restricted and how to avoid those momentarily. Missing cost and price analyses. These are for our formal methods of procurement, those procurements over the federal simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. Socioeconomic contracting. This is a rule that applies to both state and non-state entities, and that's ensuring that what we call target firms, these are small businesses, minority businesses, women business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms are considered for contracts under a FEMA award. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there are 13 required contract provisions, and we will introduce you to a great resource known as our Contract Provisions Guide a little bit later on. But those kind of round up the top 5 findings of where OIG has flagged for FEMA of noncompliance with these federal procurement standards. Okay, so I keep talking about the federal procurement rules or procurement standards, right? We affectionately referred them as the uniform rules or PUG for short. And that doesn't mean those adorable little dogs. If you think pugs are adorable, I know some people do. That's okay. PUG actually stands for Procurement Under Grants. Okay, so the federal PUG regulations, right, are found at 2 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. That's sections 200.317 to 327. And these 11 rules govern all procurement transactions under a FEMA award. FEMA has chosen to adopt these rules as opposed to maybe 44 CFR. Other federal awarding agencies, follow different federal regulations, but we've chosen to adopt the uniform rules at 2 CFR Part 200 to govern our procurements under FEMA financial assistance. And so while the primary purpose of these PUG rules is to keep costs low and reasonable, they get to some other policy objectives and other policy goals that the federal government values, including right there in the middle there, rules 321, 22, and 23. Those get to those other policy goals, right? Socioeconomic contracting, considering target firms whenever they are feasible options, providing a preference for domestically sourced goods and materials. We'll learn a little bit more about that, as well as the Build America, Buy America requirements a little bit later on in this training. And then finally, through Rule 323, right, not necessarily getting at those reasonable costs, but more so at promoting those policy objectives for the use of recovered and recycled materials whenever they are possible options. So kind of want to give you a nice little snapshot of both the OIG, non-compliance audit findings, as well as the federal procurement or PUG rules in their entirety. All right, so let's discuss applicability of rules, okay? And we really want to get nail down some definitions of how these rules apply to whether it's a state entity or a non-state entity, okay? So a state entity is actually defined at 2 CFR section 200.1 as any state of the United States, the District of Columbia, the 5 U.S. territories to include their state agencies and instrumentalities. Good example of a state agency, I'm sure many of you probably represent a state agency, would be any one of the state emergency management agencies, right? It could be your state Department of Transportation, public health, public safety, right? It might be public education, right? These are would qualify as a state entity, therefore a state agency, right? Instrumentalities are a little bit different. That might be something that would be a state-run institution of higher education here in Colorado, right? It's the CU Boulder, right? CU University of Colorado system. So that's CU Boulder, UCCS here in Colorado Springs, CU Denver, right? Those are state-run, state-funded largely institutions of higher education. Therefore, they would qualify as a state entity. Another instrumentality might be a state-run hospital, right? A state-run prison, of course, right? These would qualify as state entities. So in discussing the applicable PUG rules, of the 11, 5 apply to our state entity partners. The most important rule that many of you who again represent state entities need to walk away from is Rule 317, and that's procurement by states, okay? And essentially what that rule is telling our state partners is the same rules that you have on the books from procuring from non-federal funds, make sure you're following those same rules, right? So states, make sure that you are following your own state procurement policies and procedures when procuring under a federal award, okay? Anything that's not clearly defined within the state or in the federal rules, we're going to defer to states because it does give them maximum flexibility in conducting their procurements under a federal award. I'll have Chris drop in information. There's actually a link to our state entity fact sheet, of which he'll drop into our chat box, of which that will help kind of remind you and guide you through exactly the rules that apply to your state partners. Again, those rules 321, 22, and 23, those other policy objective oriented goals also apply to our state entities, as well as Rule 327 contract provisions. So state entity fact sheet will be dropped in, I believe, already in the fact sheet, or in the chat box. So thank you, Chris. Chris has also dropped in some information about Build America, Buy America. I do have a slide on that a little bit later on, so hold your questions about that. But I did want to give some information, of course, that's applicable to our states. And of course, just because you represent a state entity, don't go away, because these other rules, while they are exclusive to non-state entity partners, many of your organizations serve as that pass-through entity. So stick around, because this is still very, very important to your organizations. So let's discuss non-state entities, okay? So non-state entities are defined as anything but a state entity, okay? That's inclusive of local governments, right? Our cities, counties, towns, parishes, if you're coming from Louisiana, right? This also includes our Indian tribal governments in this current version of the rules. This will change a little bit later on at the start of the next fiscal year, but for the time being, if you are working with or represent an Indian tribal government, the current PUG rules classify Indian tribal governments as non-state entities, okay, non-state entities. Some hospitals, some institutions of higher education, and then also other private nonprofit organizations, houses of worship, right, would qualify as a non-state entity. Now, I put qualifications with hospitals and institutions of higher ed because we can think back to our previous slide. Some of those may qualify as state entities, or right, state-run hospitals, state-run institutions of higher education, at which point they would qualify as state entities versus non-state entities. And I did see that link for the state entity fact sheet dropped into the chat box. So thank you, Chris. That's a great resource just to recap all the rules that apply exclusively to our state entity partners. For our non-states, of the 11, 10 apply to our non-state entities. So from rules 318 through 327, those are applicable to our non-state entities. Probably wondering, well, wait a second, what's the difference? Why do non-state entities have more federal rules to follow than state partners? And the reason largely for that is because you can see how diverse this bucket of non-federal entities are in non-states, right? You have local governments, which could be cities all the way up from, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, right? All the way down to local private nonprofits, right? Many state fairs are qualify as PNPs, houses of worship, right? Our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, right? So really what these rules are designed to do is to give that foundation for our non-state entities to really protect them when they conduct these procurements, right? Because many of which that may be smaller PNPs do not have such robust procurement regulations on the books. And so these really, again, give that foundation for them to operate off of and conduct a procurement under a federal award. So let's just go ahead. I do want to touch on this in terms of which rules to follow for our non-state entities, okay? Because non-state entities are subject not only to their own organization's procurement policies and procedures, they are subject to all applicable state or tribal procurement rules and those federal procurement under grants regulations from 318 through 327. So you're probably wondering, well, this kind of creates a scenario that we may have some conflict, right? Which rules do we follow as non-state entities? Well, here at PDAT, while compliance at all levels of governance is what we are seeking, what we are promoting, right? If there's any inconsistencies or conflicts between those levels of governance, we encourage the non-state entity to follow the more restrictive rule, I'll give you an example of this really quickly. When we discuss monetary thresholds, right? Currently, the federal simplified acquisition threshold is set at $250,000. So if you are, let's say, I might have seen someone, city of Arlington, in Virginia, for example. I guess it can do that from time to time.
I still see you. I just can't see your screen anymore.
All right, let me pull it up again, guys. Sorry about that. Yeah, always you're in like a middle of a thought and it just happens to drop. So always a fun thing. Okay, guys. Looks like that again, replay is back up there. So encouraging those non-state entities, right, to follow the more restrictive rule when it comes to procuring under a federal award. Really quickly, monetary thresholds, right? Say your organization is a non-state entity, they need to be made aware of those monetary thresholds. So let's say, for example, if your city's simplified acquisition threshold is at 200,000, the state's is at 300,000, and the federal is at 250,000. You're going to follow the more restrictive threshold, the more restrictive rule, which happen to be your own organizations at 200,000 to remain compliant with all levels of governance. So again, that's what we promote for our non-state entities to ensure compliance at all levels of governance. Okay, just a knowledge check, folks. We'll use the chat box again. After learning what the difference is between a state and non-state entity, what entity type is a county government? Is it a state or a non-state? What do we think? And go ahead and drop your answers into the chat box. Yeah, looks like a consensus there. Good job, everybody. Yes, a county government is an example of a local government. Therefore, it's a non-state entity for counties. What about a Indian tribal government? What do we think here? Is that a state or a non-state entity? Awesome. Yeah, you guys knocked this one out of the park. Yeah, in the current iteration of the rules, the rules identify Indian tribal governments as a non-state entity for tribes. Okay, last one. Which entity type is a state-funded university or state-run institution of higher education, right? Is that state or non-state? Yeah, this is pretty straightforward, guys. State-funded is that key phrase. Yeah, so state-funded university is going to qualify as a state entity. All right, guys, good job. Let's move on to a little bit more beyond the basics here. Now that we know which rules apply to which entity types, let's discuss what these rules are applicable to those non-state entities. I'll highlight any rules that are kind of both apply to both state and non-state entities. But again, your organizations will largely service those pass-through entities and must ensure compliance from your sub recipients with those federal rules. So don't go anywhere. This is still really good information for you to be made aware of. So mandatory standards at Rule 318. Remember, this is the #1 area that we do see problems with compliance with the federal procurement under grant regulations. And here are the 5 areas that we kind of see those issues happening, right? #1 is conflicts of interest. The rules actually identify 3 areas of conflicts of interest: real, apparent, and organizational conflicts of interest. Real and apparent largely speak for themselves. Maybe I have a sibling or a family member, who's submitting a bid or a proposal, and I'm reviewing that, and I'm going to give their company points because of our familial ties, right? That's probably a real parent of conflict of interest. An apparent one might be, I had an old college roommate that we haven't really talked in a while, but that guy was pretty nice to me, and so I might give them a little bit more the benefit of the doubt when reviewing during bid tabulation. There might be a case for apparent conflicts of interest. Organizational conflicts of interest come into play for a lot of times in the private sector, right? Where you might have a hospital, for example, that is part of a larger corporate parent, right? When they go out to bid, maybe for this actually happened quite a bit during our COVID era, where a lot of hospitals needed additional janitorial services to make sure that their facilities were clean, right? And so under a FEMA award, they could go out and procure janitorial services. Let's say, for example, that hospital, being under that larger corporate umbrella, goes out and just hires their sister company that offers janitorial services rather than putting that bid out publicly for as many potential and eligible janitorial services as possible. So that's an example of an organizational conflicts of interest. Oversight, this kind of comes into play when we're not double checking our invoices, we're not doing regular site inspections, right? This goes hand in hand really with responsible contracting, and that's to ensure that when you do award contracts out, you're double checking what's known as FAM.gov. That's the System for Awards Management. It's the federal government's repository of federal contractors that are working under or have competed for federal contracting, but there is an exclusions list known as the suspended and debarred list. And essentially what that means is that those contractors that are on that S&D list are prohibited from competing and being awarded contracts under a federal grant. Okay, so this is, again, that ties in nicely, responsible contractors and oversight to ensure that the contractors that you do hire on do have the technical expertise, they have the bandwidth to do the work that you're hiring them on to do. They're compliant with public policy, right? They're responsible contractors. Now, I will say that about SAM.gov, it's not a requirement that contractors register with SAM.gov. So you may have to do additional steps, some more due diligence to ensure that the contractor that you're awarding that contract to is responsible. Okay, so again, it's just the rules are clear that you cannot award to a contractor that is actively suspended or debarred. And then records. So records, we will stress to keep good records sufficiently to detail the entirety of your procurements from solicitation to closeout. Maybe that might include some efforts for pre-qualified lists to demonstrate that you have solicited from those target firms under socioeconomic contracting, right? The reasons for selecting a contractor and the reasons against selecting a contractor, right? That's all going to go into your file procurement, and you will need to maintain those records until 3 years after closeout, okay? To ensure that if there is audits and monitoring that's being conducted during that closeout phase, that you were able to demonstrate, yes, we have complied with these rules because we are all really good record keepers here at NASPO, okay? So make sure that we are following these 5 mandatory standards, which will help keep you compliant with this rule. Now, as I mentioned, right, restricting full and open competition was actually the #1 area we saw non-compliance for quite some time. And really at Rule 319, this is again, a cornerstone of procurement under a federal award, right? It's meaning that all qualified, responsible, and I'll add in responsive contractors are eligible to compete for federal contractors, right? We're casting that net broadly to ensure all those contractors who are eligible are considered for federal contracts. There are numerous benefits to full and open competition, some of which include preventing fraud, waste, and abuse, but it also gets to those other policy objectives such as promoting the consideration of target firms under socioeconomic contracting. It also helps you guys, right, get that more bang for your buck, and we'll discuss whether you have to select the lowest price bid or go based upon a qualifications-based procurement in our next couple slides. So here's some examples of restricting competition. You can actually hop into, I don't think I mentioned this when I was discussing the PUG rules earlier. You can find all of these rules at ecfr.gov. Chris, if you don't mind just dropping the link to ecfr.gov for our those current PUG rules. It's really important to have that bookmarked into your browser because rules will change. We are anticipating these rules changing coming 1 October of this year, so stay tuned on that. But ECFR does a really good job because it has what's known as a point-in-time tool. And that's really important for us in the emergency management community because we need to know which rules to apply at the time of the awards given to us by FEMA, as well as the times of which our disasters are declared. So, for example, right, COVID-19 was a pandemic. It was a national emergency that was declared prior to the last iteration of rules that happened back in November 12th of 2020. So the rules applicable to COVID during that disaster deck would be applicable at that time. Whereas those of you who might be working on these more recent storms in Texas or Nebraska, Oklahoma, of course, our hurricane season of these past couple years, right? Those are going to be subject to the rules on the books currently, not the new ones. I know this sounds confusing, but what I'm really trying to hone in on, guys, is make sure that you have ecfr.gov, because you can plug in the date of your disaster decks to see exactly the rules at the time of your disasters and the times of which the awards were given to you for preparedness and resilience grants. So really, really important tool to have at your disposal there. All right, getting back to those examples of restricting competition, the rules actually give us 7 examples. We actually highlight 5 here. Brand name products only. So this happens in solicitation documents, right, where you will have an entity or a recipient or applicant, rather, have an explicit requirement in their solicitation document that, hey, if we're going out to bid for, let's say, debris removal, we want our contractors to only use Ford pickup trucks. You know, nothing against Ford, but that immediately disqualifies any other contractor that has maybe Chevrolet or GMC or Toyota, or the case might be, right? So that brand name requirement only is exclusionary, right? Now you can write into your solicitation document something that says like Ford, like GMC, that would communicate to a potential contractor saying, okay, this is the brand of vehicle or brand of equipment that we're kind of looking for. That would be permissible. Another way in which that you could communicate brand name only is if it is by industry standard or safety standard, saying, for example, hey, we have Motorola radios here at the sheriff's department. We're looking for a contractor that can fulfill this, but we would like it to be interoperable with our system. So to demonstrate interoperability or safety standards, right, it has to be Motorola. Now you can have multiple vendors that sell Motorola, but that brand name requirement is permissible because of the interoperability or safety standard argument. So there's definitely justification that can be given to FEMA that says, okay, it's not just a preference because you like Motorola or because you like Ford. It's because there's an actual reason behind that supports this reason for a brand name. Okay. Geographic preferences. Currently, the rules prohibit non-state entities from giving an outright geographic preference for contractors. There are some exceptions to geographic preferences, one of which to include is for state licensing requirements. That is permissible under this rule. Additionally, architecture and engineering contracts can be given a geographic preference. And the reason behind that really is that we believe that architects and engineers have probably a better set of knowledge and information to build in those localities versus somewhere else. And that's not a deduction or anything like that. It's just there is a preference, a geographic preference that can be given to architecture and engineering contracts. And then finally, the last exception to geographic preferences prohibition is whatever is mandated by federal law. So currently, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, I know it's a mouthful, that is the only federal law that we have currently that would allow Indian tribal governments to provide a geographic preference for Indian-owned organizations and businesses. Okay, so but other than that, geographic preferences are prohibited under a FEMA award. Requiring unnecessary experience. This comes into play, right, where it might be arbitrary to say, hey, we want a debris removal contractor to have 30 years of experience. While 30 years of experience is great, you are going to be excluding a great number of other debris removal contractors that have less than 30 years. Maybe someone has 29 years and they're just as good, if not better, than the one that has 31 years, right? Who knows? The point is that if you have a standard or requirement within your solicitation that requires unnecessary levels of experience, it could be flagged for restricting competition and therefore non-compliant with the PUG rules. So make sure that we're not including that in our solicitation documents. Excessive bonding. This kind of is a similar argument for unnecessary experience. There might be some excessive bonding for those larger capital projects where you may require a contractor to have 200% of the guarantee bond or the payment bond, right? Something that is really geared probably more so towards a one or two specific larger companies, right? So excessive bonding really does exclude out a great number of contractors. So be mindful of including excessive bonding to the point of which it is exclusionary. And then finally, allowing contractors who drafted the requirements to compete for work. We love this rule because we have affectionately referred to it as our baking your cake and eating it, or otherwise known as double dipping, okay? And what I mean by that is if you have a contractor who has been hired on to help draft the scope of work and the specifications of a contract, and we have that all the time in government. That's why we partner with industry partners, right, to bring in that subject matter expertise to our contracts. That's okay. However, that contractor who helped do all that work cannot in turn around and have their own company apply for or submit a bid or proposal for that contract they helped write the SOW for. Okay, it gives them a leg up on any competition they may have written in a way in which that really channels it and makes them the only eligible contractor for that potential contract. There's a number of issues with that, so be mindful of avoiding any double dipping or baking your cake and eating it, as it does create that that unfair advantage for that contractor. Okay. Another area that we see is also arbitrary action only. I like giving this example, and I'll move on to my next slide here momentarily. But arbitrary action is basically whatever the wind blows, right? There's really no rationale or the decision to make against a particular contractor or for a contractor is not rooted in any policy or law. I like giving this example, as mentioned earlier, right? I'm from Colorado. My colleague Chris, who's been great at answering these questions in the chat box, is originally from Pennsylvania and from Pittsburgh specifically. And so we're coming up on football season. We've kind of moved past hockey and basketball to some degree. And so as we're heading into the football season this fall, I'm a Denver Broncos fan, and he is a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. And so we can go into a lot about those kind of rivalries. However, maybe he is a PM that submitted a bid for my city's, debris monitoring contract. I'm looking at this, man, this is great. This is fantastic. But I know that Chris guy, isn't he a Pittsburgh Steelers fan? Well, I'm going to exhibit arbitrary action to, dock his company points because of his poor taste in football. We laugh at that kind of thing, but we really do have to make every effort to ensure that all contractors who are eligible for our contracts under a FEMA award have that opportunity to compete fairly. Okay, so just like giving that one when Chris hops on and supports me in these trainings. All right, guys, let me move on to Rule 320. Now that we have general procurement standards under our belt, we have full and open competition under our belt, let's move into methods of procurement at Rule 320. So the rules give us 5 methods of procurement, and they actually group them into 3 categories. The first category is our informal methods of procurement, okay? That includes our micro purchase procedures. These are procurements of up to $10,000 in aggregate, and they constitute the applicant's lowest priced procurements. Okay, we're talking pallets of bottles of water, office furniture, sandbags. I mean, things of which that you can theoretically think up to $10,000 would qualify for that micro purchase threshold. This also qualifies as a non-competitive method because you do not need to competitively solicit a micro purchase threshold or purchase procedure rather. It's small in nature, and as long as the contractor is not suspended or debarred, and the costs are reasonable under the cost principles here at 2 CFR, generally speaking, it's going to be green-lit for that. Okay, so micro purchases. There's some more information about micro purchases that the rules allow your organizations to self-certify over that $10,000 threshold and up to $50,000 on an annual basis. And so I'll let Chris drop in our informal methods of procurement. Again, these are rules that are, I just saw the note on, sorry about my nuggets. Yeah, I'm sorry about them and the avalanche as well. So it's funny. I'll have him drop in the informal methods of procurement. Again, these are rules that are applicable to our non-state entities, but we still need to be made aware of how they apply to obviously your subrecipients as state pass-through entities. Okay. Additionally, small purchases, these are procurements over $10,000 and up to $250,000, so up to that federal simplified acquisition threshold. The main difference between micro purchases and small purchases is that small purchases do require a competitive amount. So it's a competitive procurement. So it's obtaining a price or rate quotation from an adequate number of sources. How we've interpreted that is more than one, but a good rule of 3 would be supportive of that. Okay. Let's move into our formal methods of procurement. These are over $250,000, and that includes our sealed bidding and our proposals. Here's where I kind of touched on briefly in our competition section where, well, am I going to be forced as an applicant to select the lowest price bid, even though they might not be the most advantageous to our program? So if some of you might have dropped that question or been thinking about that, depends on the method of procurement you're going to be using. So sealed bids are going to be, the needs are known and specific, right? You are going to be required to award the contract to the lowest price bid from the most responsible contractor. Proposals, on the other hand, still a formal method of procurement. There are some unknowns, but you will be able to award to the most advantageous to the program. So it's a qualifications-based procurement. This lends itself really well to architecture and engineering contracts, where you do not want to be pigeonholed in selecting the lowest price bid from that architect or engineer, because it may not be the safest nor the more advantageous proposal to your organization. So those are the big differences. They're both competitively solicited, again, from that adequate number of sources. And then finally, non-competitive procurement, otherwise known as sole sourcing. This is dependent upon the facts and circumstances of the procurement. Means that it's awarded directly to one vendor. Justification is going to be required if your organizations are going to be using a non-competitive procurement. States, make sure that you check your own state procurement policies and procedures which govern these thresholds. But in my time with FEMA, I've known that state monetary thresholds are far more restrictive than the federal monetary thresholds. The big two here in FEMA, right, is our micro purchase threshold, which is at $10,000, and our simplified acquisition threshold at $250,000. So again, states, make sure that we're just double checking our own state thresholds to ensure which rules apply from micro purchasing all the way up to proposals and certainly sole sourcing. There are 5 exceptions to competition. I don't have time to get into each one of those. I'm going to spend a lot more time into E&E, our emergency and exigency. But briefly, sole sourcing includes micro purchases, inadequate competition, single source availability, federal awarding agency approval, and then of course E&E in our next slide. So Chris, if you don't mind just dropping in the link to the non-competitive procurement in our PDAT field manual, that will go over some really important information on sole sourcing. Okay, so, and it looks like I do have a couple of points on here that single source availability and inadequate competition are featured, but I really do want to hone in on emergency and exigency for you all. These are times of which that demand immediate aid or action, right? This is, of course, our wheelhouse here in FEMA, where a full competitive procurement process for debris removal, debris monitoring, you name it, of course, it's not going to lend itself well to our communities in recovering and responding to these disasters. And so the rules allow non-state entities to be accepted from competitive procurement, and they must demonstrate either an emergency or exigency circumstance for that particular scenario and provide justification to us here at FEMA of why that's being invoked. Okay, that we can see that's for a number of different reasons. Emergencies are life and limb, right? These are very powerful, devastating storms that maybe if a debris removal contract is not executed under emergency circumstances, our first responders are going to be limited in what they can do. Maybe the power is out. We need to get this debris out of the way so utility vehicles can go in and restore power. Emergencies are as they clearly are, right? They are immediate aid or action necessary for life or limb. Exigencies, on the other hand, are just as important, but they're not getting to life, right? It's more so on the financial or community-based needs. This might be opening a school in time for the school year, right? This may get at some important financial concerns for maybe a downtown business improvement district, right? Where a Cat 5 came down Main Street and say, hey, we're expected to host this major sporting event next week. How are we going to do this if we don't execute a contract rather quickly, citing exigent circumstances? And we have a great resource, our E&E fact sheet, of which Chris, I know, has probably dropped into the chat box, not kept up on it. Yes, he did. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris. Again, really hones in nicely on using We're almost there, guys. We're almost there. Let me go ahead and pull this back up. So again, E&E has been, that fact sheet has been shared in your chat box. Okay, let me move on. Yeah, and I'm back. How about that? I'm wondering if it is my bandwidth in my video. So I think I'm going to probably turn off my video, folks. I know, much to the detriment of some, probably of Chris, but I'm going to just drop it, and hopefully that helps out some of the bandwidth. Okay, so bear with me. Okay, let's continue on here. So a knowledge check, folks, another opportunity to flex some of those knowledge muscles of yours. Which method of procurement should a local township use for their needs? Okay, so I have three scenarios. These are or a couple of scenarios, I think. Options are micro purchase, small purchase, sealed bidding, proposals, or sole source. Number one, purchasing 3 sirens for severe weather alerts at a cost of $60,000. What do we think? What kind of method of procurement are we going to be working with here? So we're thinking of micro purchase or of monetary thresholds. We might have to do some math, not in public, but certainly at your own point. This is going to be a small purchase procedure, and the reason for that is because, 3 times 60,000 is going to be still. Well, I mean, rather, this one is going to, small purchase procedures for these sirens is going to come right in nicely. It's going to be over that 10,000, but under $250,000 threshold. So small purchase procedures would lend itself well for these 3 sirens. How about purchasing a fleet of search and rescue boats at a cost of $275,000? Now, it said the fleet is $275,000, not each boat. So, again, what method do we think is going to be going on here? So if you guess sealed bidding, you're correct. And the reason for that is that it's specific in cost, right? We know, I mean, let's just say it's a five boats, I don't know, but the total cost is $275,000. We know that this is clear, and sealed bidding is going to be our best option here. All right, purchasing $12,000 of Motorola DTR radios that are interoperable with existing systems. You think about this one. Any thoughts? Okay, so for this one, if you had guessed a sole source on single source exception, you are correct on this one. And the reason for that is that interoperability with existing systems would be something of this sort, okay? All right, guys, thanks so much for participating. I know the video editors are going to be definitely on their toes for this one. We're going to move into Rule 324. This is requiring the requirements for our formal methods of procurement. This is going to be inclusive of sealed bidding and proposals, right? If your organization is going to be conducting a sealed bid, these independent estimates must be conducted prior to receiving those bids and proposals, as well as conducting a cost or price analysis once those bids and proposals are received. Price analysis is pretty straightforward. It is the bottom line, the total price of a bid or proposal, versus a cost analysis, a little bit more steps involved, and those are the separate line items, right? The cost comparison of materials, labor, profit, overhead, that allow you to get the lowest price bid or proposal from the most responsible contractor. Again, these are going to be for procurements over $250,000. Some issues with time and materials, otherwise known as T&M contracts. We usually work with cost reimbursement type contracts or firm fixed price. But in the emergency management world, right, T&Ms are often used immediately following a disaster. These are direct labor hours charged at actual costs of materials. And you can use so when not possibly to initially estimate extent or duration of work. If an organization is going to be using a time and materials contract, a ceiling price must be installed with the contractor exceeding at their own risk, as well as conducting maximum oversight of the T&M contract. A non-state entity can only use a T&M contract up until the scope of work becomes clear, at which point they would need to transition to a more to a firm fixed price or a cost reimbursement model, okay? There is one contract type that is explicitly prohibited for non-state entities under the federal rules, and that's a cost plus a percentage of cost contract. We determine if we are working with a CPPC style contract, if payment is at a predetermined percentage rate. That percentage rate is applied to actual performance costs. Contractor's profit is uncertain at the time of contracting, and profit increases with increased performance costs. So if that is the case for non-state entities, it will be flagged for non-compliance. There may be an argument to be made for cost reasonableness if maybe it's just the plus percentage that non-state entities would be on the hook for, but we just say non-state entities, make sure that you stay as far away from cost plus a percentage of cost contracting, because there's no incentive for the contractor to control costs. States, on the other hand, make sure to check your own state procurement policies and procedures, but because the way in which that this contract is structured, we also encourage you all to stay away from the use of a CPPC style contract. All right, knowledge check, folks. What type of contractors are we going to be using? Total cost of an excavator rental plus 6%. Is that a firm fixed price contract, a time and materials contract, or a CPPC contract? Yes, it is a CPPC style contract, guys. Let me get this up again for you. Okay. As a CPPC style for here. All right, how about an hourly cost of excavator operator plus cost of materials?
Hey, John. I
Yes.
just want to hop in here just really quick. We're coming up on the hour, and that's totally fine. I just wanted to let everybody know that we're gonna let you finish and keep on going. If they need to leave, they can, but we are recording, and so we would love for you to finish and get through all of your things. I just wanted to put everybody's mind at ease.
Perfect. Thank you,
Thank
Kinsey.
you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, we only have a couple more slides here, folks. And again, apologies for the dropping. I'm not sure it's on my end. We'll say it's on my end. We'll blame John for this one. So apologies again for that, guys. Last question here for the knowledge check. $150 per day for excavator rental for 25 days. Total cost of $3,000. As you can see here, right, this is a pretty good micro example. Firm fixed price here. Yeah, this one would be a fixed one, guys. Let's see here. Okay, one last try. Come on, we're almost there. Okay. Jumping into those rules that apply to both state and non-state entities, guys. Rule 321, as I kind of touched on briefly in the competitive procurement section, right, full and open competition. This applies to both state and non-state entities. I'll let Chris drop that fact sheet in the chat box, as well as any other resources we have with regards to procuring using SBA resources. So this is ensuring small businesses, minority businesses, women business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms are used whenever they are possible options. There are 6 steps that states and non-states would need to demonstrate to ensure that these target firms are considered. I always encourage folks to start with step number 5, and that's using the search tools of SBA and the Minority Business Development Agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce that would help you to build out those solicitation lists. At which point then it kind of goes from there, right? Reaching out to those target firms, after you build the solicitation list. You may want to consider dividing total requirements as well as establishing delivery schedules whenever they are potential options to consider such target firms. And if subcontracting is to be let, you'll need to require the prime contractor to also consider and taking these affirmative steps of socioeconomic contracting. I do want to stipulate, folks, that this is not a quota system, nor is it a set aside. What this means is that we are creating the foundation for consideration of these target firms, okay? Required contract provisions. This is also applicable to state and non-state entities. This is where I get to introduce you to a great resource known as our Contract Provisions Guide. It has language, not only sample language, but also required language of which you can copy and paste and plug into your contracts, okay? I'm looking at you, equal employment opportunity clause, which happens to feature 8 paragraphs, okay? So make sure to jump into the contract provisions guide. We have this great matrix at the start of the resource that shows the applicability of each one of those clauses. And so I encourage you to check out the contract provisions guide, as it also has seven encouraged contract provisions by FEMA. These are things of which, the prohibition, or rather, socioeconomic contracting is an encouraged contract provision in there. The use of DHS imagery and flags, that sort of thing, is also included. So make sure to check that out, and Chris will drop that slide, or that link for the contract provisions guide into your chat box. All right, here is those domestic preferences, also applicable to both state and non-state entities. Rule 322, providing a preference for domestically sourced goods and materials to the greatest extent practicable. But there is also a requirement known as the Build America, Buy America Act, which was a part of the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act that was passed a couple of years ago. These are requirements that apply to infrastructure projects under certain FEMA awards on or after January 2nd, 2023. The big key requirements that you need to take away from what we refer to as BABA, BABAA, is providing that domestic preferences, contract language, and there are waivers that have been put into place if your organizations meet such a waiver threshold. Again, Chris, make sure to drop in that link to BABA's website, as it has information about the waivers. We have official policy on this requirement, as well as where you can learn if the FEMA grant that you're procuring under qualifies for it. So many of you, if you're procuring under the public assistance program, that is not subject to BABA. This really gets to more at the permanent work, right? The preparedness side of things. So make sure to check out that and see if the FEMA grant program that you're procuring under is subject to BABA. Okay. We've actually already touched on this, guys. Suspension and debarment, again, finding if your contractors are suspended and debarred using sam.gov. Make sure that you are conducting responsible contracting. Thanks, guys. And go Broncos. I did see that note in there. Thanks so much for that. And apologies again for all the technical issues, but thanks for staying with me and for your patience. I'll have Chris also drop in the fraud prevention fact sheet, as it does have information on where you can report suspicious activity. And in fact, what we like doing here is just kind of, recapping everything and showcasing that the federal procurement under grant regulations, these PUG rules that we've been learning about this past hour, are designed to prevent just that, is to help prevent fraud, waste, and abuse throughout all procurement phases, from planning, solicitation, and contract management. And we have a great fraud fact sheet that's also going to be included in your chat box. If you have to drop, folks, go ahead. Again, thanks so much for your participation and attention. Apologies on the technical issues, but hopefully you guys got something out of it. Please make sure to, actually, I'm going to move on here and just get you to these. This is what I really wanted to show you, kind of those rules that are applicable to exclusively to non-state entities, exclusively to states, and then rules for both. That's a really good one if you want to take a snapshot of this. Additionally, folks, I do have this information here where you can find all of that. Chris has been dropping those links in your chat box. And then I will also drop in an email address that you guys can send us queries to. So that way, if you do have follow-up questions, you can certainly send it to us that way. But that does conclude this training. So we made it. Whew, that was a doozy. But hopefully folks walk away a little bit more informed than they came in with.
I am sure they did. And John, I really want to thank you and FEMA and Christopher for all the valuable information that you all have shared today, and for working with us here at NASPO to bring it to you. That was wonderful. I know that was a struggle at times, but you did great. It was great.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and you will all receive a follow-up email containing materials from this presentation. So not the slides, but there are some additional piece of information that we can share with you. And remember, this webinar does qualify for 1 contact hour for your continuing education credits. And to receive your certificate, you just fill out the survey in your browser window once you leave this webinar. It has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page and through our Procurement U LMS in the coming days. And questions entered into the chat and QA boxes have been saved, and we'll try to follow up by email for any that were not addressed during this presentation. Don't forget to check out the upcoming webinars and other events that we have at NASPO.org. Our next webinar is Modernizing Your Procurement Office on June 12th, and you can register for this for this webinar at NASPO.org. Thank you all so much for the whole presentation. And thank you everybody for hanging in there with us. I hope you all have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.